Hey guys, this is Fallout86 for RaisyEdge.com, and today we'll be talking about playing the flop out of position in a 3-bet pot. As you can see, I created a bunch of hand examples and we'll go over them now. And we move on to pocket 8s, so very easy open, and ABC Rec on the button goes ahead and 3-bets. With pocket 8s, we have basically no decision. 4-betting is way too thin, folding is way too tight, so calling is the only option in this situation. Flop is queen 4-7 rainbow, so as you can see, 1 over card. We are not the raiser, so of course we always check to the raiser, so in this hand we check to the 3-better to the button. And he decides to c-bet around half pot, and I think this happens very often on those board textures. And again, you want to raise, fold, or call. And again, I don't think we have too many options on this board texture, because our hand is too strong to check raise bluff, too weak to check raise for value, and too strong to fold. In situations like this, I think the easy way to look at your hand is from an equity perspective. So just think about villain's 3-bet range pre-flop and then try to come up with his c-bet range. And every time you think he is probably bluffing some hands on this board texture, you have a very profitable call with pocket 8s. And of course, on this board texture, he very often has no pair, no draw, no nothing. And with pocket 8s, we have a pair, and that's why check calling is basically the only option in this situation. And this time, a loose, bad, aggressive opponent raises to 12, and we are in the big blind with pocket kings, so yeah, pretty obvious that we never want to slow play against a loose, bad aggressive opponents. So we put in the 3-bet and also want to make it larger than usual, because those opponent type does not like to fold pre-flop. They really are on this table to gamble, and therefore we want to make it a bit bigger, because our pre-flop fold equity is less, and it's always a good idea to put more money in the pot with the best hand when we can. Of course he calls, and yeah, the flop now is Jack 7 deuce with 2 hearts. And again, do you want to check raise? Do you want to bet? Do you want to check call? What's your plan on this board texture? And I think I definitely want to protect my hand. I want to get value from worse, and that's why I definitely want to start c-betting here on this board texture. And yeah, we bet 55 into basically 100, and now our opponent raises. Very interesting. And of course, it's important to look at our opponent, and when he's loose, when he's bad, when he's aggressive, he can really have a large variety of hands. He can have hands like 8-9, 9-10, hearts definitely, sometimes a jack, just a random jack to get it in, or even worse hands to get it in, like A7, raise, get it in. And yeah, that's why I think in this situation there's really only one move, and this move is to jam. Because when he makes it 135, yeah, we can't min raise or something like this, because it makes absolutely no sense. In this situation, we definitely want value, and also when we just call or min raise, we have a very awkward turn stack to pot ratio. So I think it's really max EV to just jam it on the flop, and that's what we did. We jam for 80 and he folds. Nothing we can do. Of course, when you know your opponent is bluff raising all the time on the flop and then barreling through, sure, then probably calling is way more profitable, but there are not a ton of players like that. Most players are also raising some flush draws, Jack X type hands on this board texture, and against this range we definitely want to get it in on the flop. Okay, let's move on to this super interesting hand with King Queen suited in the small blind, and the cutoff, a loose passive opponent raises to 10. So I think you already know what's going to happen. Of course, we put in the 3-bet for value and to ISO the cutoff, make it 35, and he calls. Yeah, flop is a Jack 9-3 with 2 clubs, and unfortunately we have no clubs because we have spades. Yeah, but still interesting board texture. I think we can definitely justify every line, but what do you think is probably the best line in this scenario? Bet, check call, or check fold, or check raise? And again, I think in this scenario we don't have too many options. I think c-betting small with a huge range is probably super profitable, because we have a lot of equity with our hand, but I think it's very obvious that when we check our opponent bets very large, we don't have the needed equity to call. So this hand performs pretty good in our bluffing range with 2 overcards and the gut shot, and also those opponent types will usually raise very loose pre-flop, call very loose to our 3-bet, so they have a really loose range on the flop, and therefore they will definitely fold way more enough hands, and that's why I think c-betting small is the most profitable line on this board texture. Okay, we move on with Ace King and diamonds. Loose aggressive player opens, of course we 3-bet against the leg. Again, please size not too small pre-flop. Of course he calls, and yeah, board is Queen 10-9 with 2 spades. What's your play here against a standard leg? And in this situation, I think it's important to realize that he is a leg, but he is in the early position, and therefore his range is quite strong, and this calling range usually crushes this board texture. So we check. I don't see enough fold equity on this board texture. I think, yeah, he's definitely not folding enough hands. He's floating, bluff raising too wide usually, and he also has way too many pairs and way too many straight draws, flush draws, and therefore I really like check folding against his size. Of course, when he bets way smaller, we can definitely toss in the call, because against the larger range we definitely have the needed equity to check call, no question about that. But for 110 into 152, it's definitely not the correct price, and we should just go ahead and check fold our hand. Next hand we have King Jack suited on the hijacks, so we're definitely stealing in this hand. But unfortunately the button has other plans, and he goes ahead and makes it 25. And with our hand, no question, it is in our raise call range, so we make the call. And especially when the price is so cheap, we even want to increase our raise call range. So hands that are right on the edge are now definitely a call. And also when we know our opponent is an aggressive semi-reg, then we can call a bit wider. And flop is now Queen 9-5 with 2 spades. And of course we check, because we always check heads up to the raiser. He bets 25, and yeah, what do you want to do here? And I think in this situation it's super important that you don't fold your hand. In this situation I think it's actually a great idea to go ahead and check raise. Again, don't make it too small, don't make it 50 or 60, that your opponent is calling way too often, because you want to have some fold equity with your bluffs. And when you raise for value, you also want some protection against all the draws. and therefore raising a bit bigger overall is usually a good idea, but not make it too big, otherwise your bluffs are unprofitable when you make it way too big, like 150 or 200 or something like this, or our range is just way too small overall, and we definitely don't want that. So I think 80 is probably the best size on this board texture against his small c-bet sizing. And again, you can definitely argue for check calling sometimes, but against most very aggressive opponents, I really prefer the check raise, because they will definitely double barrel a bit too often, and then we have the problem that it will be very hard to realize our equity, because we are not able to go to showdown very often with our hand, and that's why I really prefer the check raise in this particular hand. And we also have all the backdoors, right? We have the gutshot to the nuts, and we have the backdoor flush draw and 1 overcard, so a really great hand to bluff. And we move on. This time the positions are reversed, so our very loose bluffy opponent raises on the hijack. We are this time in the small blind and with ace queen suited, again very easy 3-bet. We make it 45, again value heavy, so a bit bigger. We want to have some full equity and we are deep. And yeah, given all those factors, please increase your 3-bet sizing. And now the interesting part happens. Our opponent 4-bets. Of course, happens not a ton, but when you play against very loose bluffy opponent, it happens quite regularly. And yeah, what's the best play here? Out of position, just rip it in, fold, call, hope to hit a queen. What's your plan here? And why do you think this is the best plan for this hand? Yeah, in this situation, I think it's always a very good idea to have a good idea what your opponent is doing. And I'm sure that some opponents can put in a bluff 4-bet in this situation with really a large variety of hands, especially at the live felt. And that's why I think overall the pre-flop call should be really the most profitable option, because when we call, we keep his range wide, so he has all his bluffs, and when we jam, his range is now very, very tight. I think that's pretty obvious. Now, yeah, I think those opponents maybe call with 9s plus, ace king, ace queen suited, something like this. But those opponents have the problem that they also spaz out post flop very, very often. So it's way more profitable usually to keep those bluffs in and just call with our hand, especially given the positions, because he raised on the hijack and we 3-bet in the small blind. So he knows that we don't have a huge 3-bet range in general. I think when he's on the button and we know he's over bluffing a ton, so he has way too much bluffs in his 4-bet range, then sure, no problem with just ripping it in pre-flop. We make so much money. Sometimes it's just hard to gain this edge post-flop when you just flat call pre-flop, because sometimes sure he will suck out because he has equity with all his hands, all his bluffs, and therefore jamming is never the worst idea in the world. But given our positions hijack against small blind, I think most fun players are not fold bluffing enough in those positions, and therefore calling is usually way more profitable. And of course, sometimes we have to continue even when we don't hit a pair, but this should be obvious for you. Now the board is quite favorable, I would say. Board is queen 8-8, and most of the time our opponent should not have an 8 in his hand. Of course, we are worried about kings or aces, but this is also important. When we say pre-flop, he probably has enough bluffs in his 4-bet range, and he is loose, he is bluffy, he is spewy. Then there's just no way when we hit top pair, sometimes even second pair, so the ace or the queen on a queen or ace high board, there's really no way we can get away from our hand. we are always, or most of the time, we're playing for stacks, especially in the forward pot. Because look at the pot to stack ratio, right? It's just way too low, so no way to ever fold our hand. Again, please always check to the pre-flop raiser. He bets, and again, no point in raising, right? Because when we check raise, we make his range very small, but we want to give him some room to hang himself, to jam the turn with a flush draw, with a straight draw, with a gut shot, with random garbage. And that's why it is super important just to check call flop and never check jam flop, really. Okay, this time cutoff raises sees a lag, and we have ace queen offsuit in the big blind, so very easy value 3-bet in this regard. So please do never call those hands when you think your opponent is calling a ton of worse hands to your 3-bet. Please always put in the value 3-bet with your hand. So he flats, board is 3-7-9 rainbow, so not that bad, definitely. And again, I think against most lags that call way too wide, a c-bet is in order. Again, we can c-bet pretty small, we get a decent price, and yeah, this is really auto profit spot where those people are definitely overfolding. Of course, when they adapt and peel very loose on the flop, then we should definitely switch over to a way more polarized range. But when we are unsure, always c-bet 1/3 on those kind of board texture. Okay, our next hand is pocket tens. We raise from under the gun, and the tight passive player to our left in MP 3-bets. He 3-bets to 40. We play 1-3, so standard 3-bet sizing, nothing to talk about. And against the tight passive player, I think it's pretty obvious that we should never 4-bet this hand, 4-bet fold or 4-bet call. This is just pure spew, I would think. Because for 4-bet folding, our hand is way too strong, and yeah, his 3-bet range overall is just way too tight. And 4-bet call is out of the question, I think. So we have to call, as we should always do against most opponents. Flop is quite favorable. Flop is 10 jack 5 with 2 spades. Again, we are not leading, so we check. Our opponent bet 65 into 84. And the question is, do you want to slow play? Do you want to raise? Do you want to jam? Or do you want to... Nah, okay. Folding is out of the question. And again, I think in this situation it's pretty easy. I think we have only one option on this very draw heavy board texture, and the option is to rip it in. Because when you bet 65, to what size do you want to raise? To 180, but the problem is our effective stack size is so small. So when we raise to 180, then there is 2, 4, so 450, nearly 500 in the pot, and we have around 200 bucks left. This absolutely makes no sense. So please always pay attention to the stack to pot ratio. The other problem is with most draws, we definitely want to check jam and not call most situations, and therefore, yeah, just jam it when you have the nuts. And I think in this situation he's calling with aces, kings, queens, some ace king, ace queen spades type hand, and yeah, basically that's it. I think he's folding all the ace king combinations, and he shouldn't have a ton of other bluffs in most situations. And yeah, when this works out, it's a super probable shove, because yeah, we really get in all the chips against queens, kings, aces all the time. And on a ton of turn cards, he's just never giving us all his money, because now he's scared. And sometimes we are scared too, so when the turn is a spade or a queen or a king or an ace, then it's way harder to get value. And therefore, please check shove in a situation like this, and you'll definitely get all the money. Okay, next interesting hand, we have ace queen off. ABC reg puts in the steal from the cutoff, and of course we are always 3-betting or folding in the small blind against the cutoff steal. No fun player behind, so therefore we want to 3-bet and ISO and value. Our opponent calls. Flop is not too bad. Flop is king queen 8 with 2 clubs. Unfortunately, we don't have a club and we don't have a king either. So not the perfect scenario, but still we have a strong hand. But I think in this situation against a cutoff calling range, I really prefer a more polarized c-bet range, so bet a bit bigger. As you can see, there are a ton of draws out there. You can of course call with a lot of hands to our c-bet, so with hands like Jack 10, 9 10, Ace 10, Ace Jack, Queen X, King X, 8X, clubs. So not a lot of hands can fold here, especially when he is an ABC reg. He's not raising too loose, he's not calling a ton of hands to 3-bet. This is very important to realize, and therefore I really prefer polarized bet sizing. And when we want to bet a bit more polarized on the board texture, I think we should only bet a good king and some straight and flush draws, and usually that's it. All the other hands should be in our check call range or check raise range, and ace queen is definitely not in our check fold range and definitely not in our check raise range because it's way too strong for that. So we should always check call this hand. This time we have pocket jacks and the leg on the button 3-bets. And again, when you don't know this opponent very well, you don't know his 3-bet range, then I'm always in for the call. And when you know he's really out of line, he's 3-betting a crazy amount, and he's also calling most of the, or a lot of those hands to the 4-bet, then I would always value 4-bet. But unless you're sure, be a bit cautious, even when you think he's a bit on the looser and the more aggressive side. Then calling, at least in those positions, should be still a bit more profitable. So we toss in the call. Flop is deuce 5-5, and again, check raise or check call. I think both options here are on the table. And as I mentioned before, those legs really love to second barrel, therefore we want to fold a bit more hands on the flop. But pocket jacks we're definitely not folding, but that's why we want to go for the check call and never for the check raise, because when we check raise we just make his range very, very small. Of course, he's never folding a better hand when he has a 5 or queens, kings, aces. He's always going to continue, but when he has a bluff, like 9-10 offsuit, he's just giving up. But very often when the turn is a scare card, so just an overcard to the board, yeah, they're just barreling away, so they're betting turn. Sometimes they're also bet river, so we should definitely keep his range very wide, that he is able to bluff on the turn and maybe on the river, and therefore please always check call in those situations. Okay, again, second best hand ever created. We have pocket kings against the cutoff steal. Loose passive player flats, and of course we want to squeeze really big, so we make it 55. Super important to not make it too small. The leg calls and the button folds, so heads up to the flop. Flop is queen 10-7 with 3 spades. As you can see, we have not a spade. And again, how large or how small do you want to c-bet here, and why? Or do you want to check this hand, check call or check raise? Again, all the options are on the table. And with our hand, I think a value bet is still in order, because we get a lot of value from worse hands, and we are also able to bluff a lot on this board texture with a small sizing. And the problem is really when he has not a spade, he really can float too light. So this board is definitely not that bad for bluffing and also for value betting. Sure, there are 3 spades, but how often does he really has a flush? Not too often, right? Maybe in 5% of the time. And yeah, as you can see, this hand is definitely value bet. And when you think about the situation, it's way easier when you look at the hand from an equity perspective. So just type in your hand, pocket kings with no spade, and then please think about his calling range. And most players here calling with even under pairs, no spades, with 10x, queen x, no spades, and of course with with most spades in their hand, and therefore very easy value bet. Okay, next hand we have king 10 suited, whale makes it 10, and yeah, we're definitely 3-betting king 10 suited. The loose passive player overcalls in the big blind, really interesting, and yeah, of course the maniac whale calls, so really hope to hit something, and we did. Flop is king 6 3 rainbow, so we flop top pair, no kicker. Yeah, what's your play here and why? I think in general this is really the perfect board to c-bet a bit lighter or very light, because yeah, it's really dry. King 6 3 rainbow. We have definitely a lot of range advantage here overall. So yeah, I really love to c-bet when my opponent is not a maniac. But as you can see, our opponent is the maniac, and they really love to gamble, they love to bet against missed c-bets, and that's why I prefer the check here. Also with our hand, I think 3-handed we can not go usually for 3 streets of value, so we just hope that the maniac bets flop, bets turn, bets river with some straight draw, or just with a random trash hand and he feels like barreling. And we are usually not losing a ton of value because we are always getting our 2 streets. So when it's check around on the flop, we just bet turn big, bet river big, and there we have our 2 streets. And as I mentioned, with king 10 on king 6 3 rainbow in a 3-bet pot, I think we have max 2 streets. I think when we go for 3 streets all the time, we get called very often by better hands. So we check. Interesting enough, the loose passive player leads. Yeah, the maniac calls, and yeah, again, very easy call in this situation. We get decent odds or we get very good odds. We have pretty strong hands, and even the loose passive opponent can have worse pairs, worse kings. And also when the prefer raiser checks, so we checked, then players are way more inclined to even bet very weak hands, and therefore check calling is super profitable in the situation. And this was the last hand for this hand example video. I really hope that you enjoyed all the hand examples, and of course if you have any questions, always feel free to ask. And yeah, I'll definitely see you next time, and this was Followed86 for RaiseYourEdge.com. Bye bye.